Israel is now revealing concrete evidence, literally concrete evidence, that Hamas used the Shifa hospital as a base for its terror attacks. Yesterday, we revealed a tunnel shaft that extends 10 meters underground in the Shifa hospital. That's like 2 double-decker buses. And when you get to the bottom of that tunnel shaft, it extends for another 55 meters, and then there is a blast door with a gun hole. Now, I don't know whether you've ever seen an underground tunnel like that leading to a blast door at the Royal Free Hospital or any hospitals in the UK. We don't have them here in Israel. It's clear that Hamas used that hospital as a command center. Not only that, we also showed CCTV footage of hostages being manhandled into the hospital on October 7th. And I know some people are trying to spin this to cover up perhaps their own complicity with Hamas propaganda and say they're being taken there for medical care. No, no, no. One of those hostages does not appear to be injured and is being dragged in by terrorists with a meat cleaver and with guns. And the amazing thing is they did that in broad daylight, surrounded by medical staff. All the doctors at the Shifa hospital knew. They knew Hamas was using the Shifa hospital to hold hostages, and they said nothing. All those doctors who for a month have now been quoted by the international media about the situation inside the hospital were either cowed by Hamas or actively collaborating with it. In any case, they were complicit. They knew and they said nothing. And the fact Hamas used the Shifa hospital as a terror base has been the Gaza Strip's biggest open secret. And now it's not even a secret anymore. Now it's out in the open.
How concerned are you by the way in which aid agencies operating in that hospital have failed to recognize the fact that Hamas were operating there?
International aid agencies and the human rights industry, their behavior in this conflict has been atrocious. They have been complicit with Hamas propaganda, and complicit with Hamas's human shield strategy. It is astonishing the lengths to which Israel is going to prove that Hamas used that as a terror base, while international agencies still refuse to condemn Hamas using that hospital as a terror base, while continuing to tweet all sorts of nonsense that pins the blame on Israel, as if Israel woke up one morning and decided it wanted to take pot shots at a hospital instead of targeting the terror infrastructure under that hospital, after spending a month urging people to get out of the way because we don't want to see civilians being hurt. So the Red Cross, the World Health Organization, we hold them all complicit with Hamas's human shield strategy. And I'll say we've been failed by these institutions. But we hope that countries around the world understand just how poorly they have been served. Just how poorly they have been served by institutions that are failing to do their jobs. You know, David, it's really hilarious when you think about it. The World Health Organization was in the Shifa hospital over the weekend to complete a risk assessment. At no point in that risk assessment did they mention that IDF soldiers were literally outside digging up evidence of Hamas terror tunnels at the same time. At no point in that risk assessment did they mention that Hamas had been using that hospital to store hostages. The fact the United Nations has not condemned Hamas's abuse of hospitals is outrageous. And I'll tell you one thing. One day, in a free Gaza, after Hamas, I expect the Hamas terror tunnels to become an international tourist attraction, like the Churchill war rooms, like the Paris catacombs, and maybe the United Nations will finally admit that those Hamas terror tunnels exist when UNESCO declares them a World Heritage Site. Until then, their silence is complicity, and their silence is shameful.
What is the motivation here then? Is this people on the ground being scared of Hamas, or is this some sort of anti-Israel demonization exercise?
First of all, no one is free to speak their minds inside the Gaza Strip. This is an authoritarian terror regime that controls the flow of information out. They know they're not free to tell the full story. That applies to the doctors, some of whom are openly collaborating with Hamas. And it applies to the so-called freelance journalists in the Gaza Strip. There is no such thing as a freelance journalist in jihadi-controlled territory. But absolutely, there is deep institutional systemic rot in these organizations. In the Red Cross that has not been able to condemn Hamas's use of hospitals and ambulances as human shields, even though they knew. In the World Health Organization that has not been able to condemn Hamas for jeopardizing those hospitals' protected status, even though they knew. in all the UN women's rights organizations that have not said a word about the brutal rape and sexual violence and mutilation of Israeli women and girls on October 7th. We think they should all hang their heads in shame. We are disgusted by them. We expect to be let down by them, and we hope the rest of the world understands just how poorly served they are by these global institutions that are failing to do their job and have chosen to take the side of the terror group that perpetrated the atrocities of the October 7th massacre.
And as we know at the moment, these aid agencies have not yet had access to any of the hostages taken by Hamas on October the 7th. In terms of hostage talks, there are some murmurs from Qatar of a deal in the next few days. What is the latest there?
You'll appreciate that I can't comment on sensitive negotiations because human lives hang in the balance. The less we say, the better. But I will say the hostage crisis is very personal for every family in Israel. We're talking about 240 hostages in a small country of only 10 million people. Everyone knows someone who has taken hostage. We're talking about 30 children, 10 toddlers under the age of 5, some of whom were orphaned by Hamas, who are being held in inhumane conditions in a dark tunnel somewhere by the same terror organization that massacred and tortured and mutilated and raped their friends and families on October 7th. The whole of Israeli society is sick with worry, and I can tell you, no one in Israel has been sleeping properly for the last 25 days, as we have 30 children being held incommunicado by terrorists in the Gaza Strip.
In terms of the military operation itself, the aim is to destroy Hamas's terrorist infrastructure and capability. How do you make that judgment? Because presumably certain terrorists will blend back into the general population. It's impossible to kill every single Hamas terrorist. How do you determine when you're at success point?
Hamas is playing dirty. Hamas is playing dirty by disguising its own fighters as civilians, by passing off its own military fatalities as being civilian, hiding underneath civilian facilities. Hamas is playing dirty. And despite that, or rather because of that, we have no choice but to totally eliminate Hamas in response to the October 7th massacre. We cannot allow it to hold territory any longer. And we know this is going to be difficult, but that doesn't change the fact that this is a strategic necessity. You know, the UK and the other 85 nations of the anti-ISIS coalition that ganged up on Daesh 10 years ago faced a very similar challenge. How do you know when you've been successful when the terrorists are operating from inside densely populated civilian areas? But they still went ahead and they did what they had to do. You know, one of the funny questions I get asked in these interviews is, you know, you can't destroy an idea. You can't defeat an idea, and you're only going to radicalize another generation of young Palestinians. And our answer to that is, look, we're not trying to destroy an idea. We're trying to deny that idea a territorial foothold from which it can direct attacks against our people. And just as 86 nations banded together to destroy ISIS, because Islamic extremism can live on, but it cannot be allowed to have a state from which to attack people, we're going to do the same. The only difference is, we're not flying halfway around the world. Our ISIS is literally in our backyard. It's meters away from people's homes. And we have to destroy Hamas so that our people can return to their homes, to the villages that Hamas ethnically cleansed, in which it committed acts of systematic extermination on October 7th, because we have to make sure that atrocities like that can never happen again.
And is there any more detail on what happens afterwards as yet? There was talk about Israel temporarily taking security control of Gaza. There's been other comments coming out of the States of some sort of global force followed by the Palestinian Authority. Where do you see the future in this enclave?
We're looking at several options with our international partners for the day after Hamas. I can tell you they'll be guided by 3 main principles. First, the Gaza Strip must be demilitarized. It must never again be allowed to host a terror organization able to shoot tens of thousands of rockets at Israel, invade at will, and abduct our citizens. This war will end when the Gaza Strip is no longer a security threat to the people of Israel, as it has been for the last 16 years since Hamas took over. Gaza will be demilitarized. The second thing is maybe more important. The Gaza Strip must be de-radicalized. We cannot have another generation of Palestinian children being brought up by Hamas, by UNRWA, a UN agency, on a diet of indoctrination and jihad, taught to hate Israel, taught that their vision is to so-called liberate Palestine from the river to the sea, and there's no room for Israel to exist. They must be de-radicalized. No one during the 1940s said, if we bomb more Nazis, it will only radicalize more Germans. Because after the Second World War, the Allies de-radicalized Germany and Japan, and now they are prosperous, democratic countries and US allies, and we hope the same will happen in the Gaza Strip when they realize that terrorism is a dead end. And the third is the Gaza Strip must be rebuilt. And it must be rebuilt in a way that ensures that the concrete that goes in for people's houses isn't sent into more tunnels underground. It must be rebuilt in a way that ensures that the pipes that are delivered for water are used to transport water and aren't dug up and used as rockets against us as they have been before. Those are the three principles: demilitarize, de-radicalize, and rebuild. And we look forward to working with our international partners to see how that can be put into practice and what interim security arrangements should be put in place. As the President of the United States said, interim security measures will have to be in place so we can ensure that Gaza and the West Bank are never, ever, ever used as bases of terrorism against the people of Israel again.
You mentioned the West Bank there, and clearly there is an operation there in terms of curbing terrorist activity, but also there must be a conversation to be had about extremism on the part of settlers. Where do you see that, and how much is Israel doing to combat those, I guess, vigilantism?
The situation in the West Bank is that we entered this war with Hamas in the Gaza Strip after, I believe, the deadliest year in a long time of terror attacks emanating from the West Bank. And when this war started, Hamas tried to drag Palestinians in the West Bank into the conflict, telling them, grab your knives, grab your guns, and join this war against the Jews. So we're trying to contain that at the moment and stop this war from escalating, even though just the other day we killed the terrorists who are on their way to Jerusalem to perpetrate a terror attack there. And now, as for vigilante violence by settlers, there is obviously no excuse for that. We will not tolerate hooliganism. We will not tolerate vigilantism. Anyone trying to take the law into their own hands, that is completely unacceptable. The vast majority of the Israelis who live in the West Bank are law-abiding citizens. We have a problem with a small, radical, extremist minority that thinks that it is above the law. It is not, and that must be dealt with very firmly. We don't want to see this conflict escalating. Hamas is trying to escalate the conflict. Hamas is trying to drag Palestinians in the West Bank into the violence. Hamas is egging on Hezbollah in the north to step up its aggression against our people. We spent the last month facing rocket fire and mortar fire from Lebanon. Hamas is trying to drag them in. They're trying to drag in the Houthis in Yemen as well. But at the moment, we're focusing on the Gaza Strip. We're focusing on that important mission that has wall-to-wall unity in this country, destroying the monsters who perpetrated the October 7th massacre, the deadliest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, and making sure that they can never, ever, ever do that again.
How confident are you that there'll be more evidence in the next days of Hamas operations being revealed at Shifa and potentially other hospitals?
The evidence of Hamas infrastructure under Shifa Hospital is ongoing. It's being uncovered, and I expect that not only in the days, but in the weeks and months ahead, we will continue to literally unearth the evidence of Hamas embedding itself under the Shifa Hospital. And I think that a lot of people who dug themselves in very deep, denying that Hamas had terror infrastructure under Shifa, a lot of people who are very heavily invested in denying that are now beginning to look very, very, very silly as that evidence comes to light. And people rightfully ask international agencies and officials, what did you know? If you didn't know, how did you not know? And if you knew, why did you not say anything? And why are you continuing to cover up for Hamas instead of calling it and bringing it to account for abusing hospitals for military purposes that way?